Mortimer shut the door behind him quietly as he and Tony exited the cellar an hour after Eve had left them alone. Once she was satisfied that Tony was going to keep Mortimer's secret safe, she merely went back to her room to sleep, leaving the two men in the dark to talk alone. They didn't say much for quite a while, and finally Mortimer had decided to put Tony's spirit at ease. He informed him that Eve regularly gave him a small blood bag, once a week, that kept his cravings in check. So long as he wasn't too badly injured, that is. And she kept a slightly larger supply of her own blood as backup in case he was. Each week she would draw from the supply, filling a smaller bag for the week. When the larger one was fairly low, then she would fill another bag to replace the near empty one. No words were said as to how the old vampire and his young mistress had gotten the supply, but Tony was willing to reach the subject later at a less awkward point in time. Eventually they got up at the end of their various discussions and ascended the creaking steps. They now stood outside it in the silent hall, one of the few sections of the house where the floorboards had been properly supported to lessen the creaking. Looking back at the door, Tony remembered that Eve had hired him as a caretaker of the manor, and that his boss was planning on filling up some of the empty rooms of the manor with tenants. Others who might, like he had, accidentally discover the vampire's secret.
You know, after I got my room set up, I can put a lock on the door for you,
Tony offered until Mortimer rose a gentle hand to silence him.
You would have to ask the mistress first. I keep insisting that she allow me to purchase one, but she still thinks I'd be locking myself in and making schemes or something like that.
The young man sighed lightly, and then his shoulders drooped ever so slightly, his brow furrowing minutely, shattering his maintained image of upper-class grooming and servitude for a mere moment, before piecing it all back together again, fluidly in a manner that none of the chinks in his armor were visible, or the cracks in the surface of his image. He muttered something in what Tony could only guess was French. Before the youth could even say anything, the vampire closed his eyes and sighed again, without letting his shoulders droop this time. Mortimer offered a gesture for Tony to continue walking, and Tony complied with a shrug as he put his hands in his pockets to move half a step behind the taller man.
I guess I'll have to since she owns the place, but I could just use a keyed one and give her a copy,
Tony said, mostly to himself since he assumed that something so simple would have already been denied by Eve. For some reason, the woman seemed to harbor some feelings of mistrust for a servant that had been with her family since before her conception was even considered in the minds of her ancestors. She regularly kept his unusual needs and palate satisfied, letting him even go so far as to turn an IV tube into a straw so that he could keep his face clean as he drank from the crimson nectar that his body craved. She could have possibly ordered him into a task that she knew would kill him, but she hadn't. It seemed to be more than just merely allowing him to live because of pangs of conscience, and not being afraid of ordering him to leave her presence and feed upon the outside world instead. There was some history between the two. History he knew must have gone back to her earliest memories of him, but it seemed there might be a specific event or period of time that had been considered her against him. A mystery for another time, another enigma to unravel if he wanted to lessen tensions in the manor. And now he would observe. Before he was forced to choose a side in a future conflict, he needed to make an informed decision. Observe and listen. It was all he would, no, could do until he could grasp a larger perspective. His thoughts returned to his surroundings again as one of the persons in question was making a thoughtful synthesis of a hum and a moan with his eyes distant in concentration over some puzzling matter. Tony was about to ask what the problem was, hopeful that perhaps his outside perspective might be of assistance, regardless of his naive, babe-like ignorance of what the situation may be regarding the problem. He found that, before he could part his lips, the man had finally spoken, and the subject shocked him.
I hadn't thought of that. How long to make a copy? A trip to your local locksmith a day's wait?
Here he was thinking the door problem had been simple. Eve had not only told her servant that he could not have one, but she had refused to listen to any comfortable rationalizing of its possibility. Now he was faced with this new information. In addition to whatever event had affected the two before, or possibly in correlation to it as well, Mortimer simply was out of sync with the world around him. It was as if he had been stolen from whatever time he had been turned into a vampire directly to the present day, or as if he had been prevented from leaving the grounds of the manor during his entire time living with Eve. With his face still mildly showing his confusion, Tony answered Mortimer's question almost mumbling, as if he were an embarrassing teen asking his parents to stay a certain distance away during their shopping in a mall.
More like 10 minutes at a local hardware store. Some lunch might even have 2 copies with it.
Oh.
It was all the vampire said.
You really haven't gotten out much, have you?
Tony asked, and Mortimer squished his fingers together childishly as his face betrayed how uncomfortable he was even without the unusual habit. Pale as he was, Mortimer's cheeks even seemed to flush slightly pink for a mere second.
Not in this century.
So, what, you've worked for Eve's family for that long? Tony's eyes grew the size of watermelons in awe. He had figured that Mortimer had worked for Eve's parents, possibly having been given no small measure of compassion and aid. Mortimer surprisingly laughed and began to tell a fraction of his history, and even that would make his new co-workers' respect and awe increase considerably that night, as well as his comfortable acceptance of the vampire's existence and presence.
Ha! Many more years than that. Eve's great-great-grandfather found me when he built the mausoleum in the backyard for his father. I had been staked to a tree nearby for 50 years, and he tried to give me a proper burial.
He tilted his head back and cocked it to the side, his eyes drifting upward and to the left as he threw his memory back to that day. It was a dry summer day with a slight breeze that had turned the fields of wheat surrounding the house and barn into a sea of golden waves, constantly redirecting under different currents and pressures. The house and barn would later be replaced with the first portion of the manor. That was a good 30 years off. At the time that he had first met Eve's ancestors, the only forest there was a small amount where he had been staked against one of the trees. Later, those same trees would, along with their siblings and cousins in the distant neighboring lands, spread wide their offspring and their seeds, grow up to form this forest surrounding the manor and most of the town, before it had been turned into a suburban paradise. That day, after crawling out of his own grave for a second time in his life, Mortimer's hunger drew him towards the house, where the man who had tried putting his soul to rest was living along with his pregnant wife. Covered in dirt, he managed to drag himself up to the porch.
Imagine his surprise when I had knocked on the door the next day.
Mortimer said with a smile, then repeated verbatim what he had said almost 2 centuries ago.
I'm sorry to bother you, sir. But could you please spare me a few pints of blood?
One of the corners of his mouth dimpled for a second as he smirked at the phrase he had uttered to the stranger while on the porch before collapsing under hunger.
Jonathan Archimedes Bloodstone was a man of surprising compassion, even for one such as myself, and he nursed me back to health with the help of his livestock. He graciously served his family, and he was the closest friend I had in over a century.
Slowly, the vampire opened up his suit and shirt to show something that appeared like an old scar or a burn on his chest. As Tony moved closer to inspect it, he let out a small gasp as he realized that it was a branding, of an unusual and certainly arcane sort, but a brand nonetheless. Mortimer didn't seem to notice the youth's reflex, and he continued speaking as he buttoned his shirt back up.
I gladly had this branded to my flesh so that I should never cause harm to him or any he cared for. In return, he never asked anything of me, and yet I had served his family for over 200 years. Not all of his lineage was as kind as he, but I was a monster before he took me under his wing.
Tony puzzled this over for a while and finally made a comment as they approached another doorway. So he essentially adopted you, but didn't treat you like a kid. I would have liked to meet him. Tony stated with a slight smirk, but Mortimer could tell that it was not in jest. He merely halted his movement and stared at the youth again for a moment, studying him, before turning his head again and continuing past the doorframe. Despite all the hair covering Tony's face, he wore his emotions on his sleeves, and on his lips, and in his eyes, perhaps on purpose, or perhaps subconsciously.
Very astute. When you aren't being immature, you're actually mildly endearing. Jonathan would have liked you.
Thanks, I think, Tony said, unsure whether or not to take the middle part of that as a compliment. As he too passed the doorframe, however, his eyes were drawn to the interior of the room. Hold up a sec. He leaned back and examined it closer.
Yes, what is it?
I don't know, Tony said as he stepped through the frame. It was an empty room on the first floor, with 2 entrances, one with a door hanging loosely on its hinges, and the other, where he stood, without a door. The frame itself, a few stains and some other minor damage, but the wall was still structurally intact, so replacing it would be relatively simple. It was fairly rectangular for the most part, but instead of a simple corner, another wall jutted at an angle, cutting at almost 45 degrees as it connected the 2 walls. The carpet had been torn up in some spots, and it had a few maroon stains on the remaining sections. The floorboards underneath seemed to be fine, however, but he would have to inspect them later, just to make sure. All in all, despite its necessary upkeep, it was a moderately well-sized room, almost twice as large as his room had been at home. A single window let the moonlight in, and Tony finished his thought. But I think it'll be my new room. It needs some work, but that's what I'm here for, right?
He really would have liked you.
Mortimer said behind him, and Tony rotated to see that he was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed lightly, not in confrontation, but in simple comfort and pride.
This room has barely been touched in decades. But it used to be his room when the manor was first built. After he tore down this smaller house he had lived in prior with his wife and children. Of course, the house has been expanded since then, but most of the structural woodwork is the same. Just a different face over it.
So you care for this old place, huh? Tony asked, then started scratching the top of his head in sudden confusion. You obviously know enough about how it used to be to restore most of it, so why did he even need to hire me? Mortimer fumbled for words, then stated sheepishly.
Besides the fact she doesn't trust me getting the supplies, I'm not a very capable handyman, we found out.
He told them of the various failures the two of them had faced when they had tried to fix up the manor on their own. One time he had even driven a nail straight through his thumb, and Eve had to pull it out. That was one of the last events before she had decided to post the ad, a little over 2 months ago. They had interviewed quite a few other people, and a few had even seemed hopeful prospects. However, they too had discovered the vampire's secret and needed to have their memory of it erased. Tony was different in that way. Even Mortimer had to admit that, and after enough time speaking with him, he started to feel more comfortable opening up to this strange youth. Finally, he let out a deep breath as if a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He extended out a hand to his new coworker.
I'm sorry I overreacted earlier, but if you need assistance, know where to find me.
Just knock first, right? Tony said, smirking slightly as he shook Mortimer's hand.
Thank you, yes. If I'm slow to respond, I'll be off for a few hours, though.